Right. Welcome everybody to Cliff Notes with Dave and Emily. I presented at an APWA conference a couple of years ago, and I had the pleasure of watching one of Dave's sessions. And I remember thinking, we read a lot of the same books, but not all of the same books. And I wondered, what else is Dave reading and what could I learn from what he's reading? So that's really what brings us here today. The sort of concept behind our session is to bring you guys the ideas that really energize us in what we're reading. So to give you kind of a layout of what we're going to do today, I'm going to take sort of a broad overview of multiple pieces that I've read, and Dave's going to take more of a specific look at individual books that really impacted him that he read. So with that, I'm going to jump right in and start with our first lesson, which is that small talk should be a planned adventure. So for those of you who don't know me, I am an introvert. And what that means is that I get a little bit nervous when it comes to small talk or social engagements. And to give you guys a specific example, I do a little bit of coaching. I'm working my way toward an accreditation. And I was giving a coaching session the other day with a coachee that I have met with numerous times, 5 or 6 times. So not a stranger to me at all. But this person started posing questions to me. And that made me feel a little bit anxious. And I actually started to physically feel that sort of anxious introvert feeling and actually started shaking a little bit responding to her questions. So pretty extreme introvert on that side of things. So the question is, what do I do when part of my job is to be in social situations, to go to happy hours, to attend conferences, do speeches like this one? How do I sort of reconcile those two ideas so that I can be successful as an introvert in social situations? So one of the things that I read that I thought was really interesting is this concept of planning your social interactions. And that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable when I'm walking into small talk engagements. So here are a few ideas of how you can plan for your small talk. So first one, practicing 10-second relationships. Practicing 10-second relationships. So a 10-second relationship, for example, is talking to the barista when they bring your coffee, or talking to the cashier when they check you out, saying hello to somebody who's walking towards you as you're walking down the street. These 10-second relationships both actually warm you up sort of to that person that you're talking to, but they also warm you up to other social interactions. So the more that you practice, the easier it becomes. The next sort of strategy to preparing to go into small talk or conversational interactions is practicing free association brainstorming. So free association brainstorming is really a mapping exercise that you can use to help branch topics, to help provide useful transitions between topics. So sometimes what will happen to me, for example, is I'm at a happy hour, somebody brings up a topic, I have no idea what they're talking about, and I don't know where to go from that conversation. So for example, somebody starts talking about Game of Thrones, and maybe you don't watch Game of Thrones, but practicing free association brainstorming, maybe you think, oh, I read a lot of epic novels, or I really love Peter Dinklage and Elf, or I know a lot about the royal families, or maybe I have a hobby in chair building. So practicing this free association brainstorming helps your mind become attuned to transitions or useful ways of jumping from one topic to another in conversation.
Made me very curious about chair building because I've never seen Game of Thrones. So, another topic for another time.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later then. All right, so the next strategy is sort of practicing your physiological preparedness. So being physically prepared to go into small talk. And a couple of ways that you can do that. One is to get your blood pumping. So even right before Dave and I started doing this, I went for a walk outside because I knew I was going to be feeling anxious. Doing push-ups, jogging in place if you can't actually go somewhere. Another one that's important for me is reading out loud. As somebody who's a little self-conscious about the sound of my own voice, practicing reading out loud gives me that familiarity so that I'm not jarred when I start talking in front of a large group of people. And then the last one here is practicing mirroring. So for example, if you're talking to somebody and they lean a little bit forward, maybe you lean a little bit forward. Or if they lean back, maybe you lean back. And the idea is not to copy them exactly like some kind of scary robot, but just to kind of mimic their actions a little bit, because studies have shown that that encourages warmth between the people who are interacting. So the next piece of it is psychological preparedness. And that's really sort of getting your mind ready for the social interaction. I think the sort of preparedness element that really speaks to me is constructing your story in advance. So one example of sort of nerves getting the best of me in social situations is if I'm at the water cooler and somebody asks me, what did you do this weekend? I immediately forget everything that I did this weekend, and I start to wonder if I did anything this weekend. So constructing your story, thinking about what did you do this weekend? What are some projects you're working on that you're excited about? Some interesting stories you like to tell, just having that box of ideas ready so that you're not taken aback when somebody asks you a question. And then the last one here is to be warm. So sometimes when we're in a social situation, we'll default to the technical, to talking about specific elements of the work that we're doing because that's where we're comfortable. But in the spirit of Maya Angelou, it's not what you say to people, it's how you make them feel. And being warm is the really critical component to being sort of remembered and liked and having those successful social interactions. So some quick ways to do that: ask questions, smile and nod. And if all else fails, you can actually hold something warm, like a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and that will help you feel warm, which then helps you exude warmth when you're talking. So lesson learned for this one: small talk should be a planned adventure. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Dave.
Well, thanks, Emily. That was great. So I'm going to get into a little bit of depth about one particular book that is one of my favorites that I ever read. I'm going to try to relate it a little bit back to our industry, but it's this book by a man named Steven Johnson, and it's really about these 6 foundational technologies and the derivatives of them from whence modern civilization is possible. Really, and a couple of the interesting things he brings up consistently throughout the book are these adjacent possibilities that become possible because certain technologies exist, and then these interesting societal changes that stem from all the technology. And so I'll go through each of the 6 very briefly, and these are really fascinating. So the first one is cold. So the technology of cold. How do we freeze things? How do we refrigerate? Air conditioning. You take air conditioning as an example. Its existence allows us to live in places like Phoenix or Alabama or Florida or perhaps even the Sahara Desert. You look at refrigeration and freezing technologies that actually allows us to ship food to a different place from where it was made. So you don't have to have everybody live exactly where all the food is made. And then I love that photo on the top right. That's an old school actual ice box with a block of ice in there. And so before electronic refrigeration, there were actual ice boxes with blocks of ice. And they used to actually ship ice from up in Boston all the way down to the equator. It was just this crazy thing. So that was just one of the more interesting sort of foundational technologies from whence a lot of different things have derived. The second one is clean. So sanitation, hygiene, these sorts of things. Because of sanitation, it's what allows us to all live in these really populated cities and not get each other sick from a lot of waterborne illnesses, which were really the source of a lot of the ancient plagues, right? So water sanitation is a big one. And of course, COVID is this new thing of kind of preventing us from getting into large groups. And that's a whole other story. But clean also leads to the ability to make microchips. Microchips need really clean water to be able to be created. And then that photo in the upper left, that's actually from the city of Chicago. When Chicago was populated, is on the edge of Lake Michigan, and there was no grade change. So everything, all the sewage would just sit there. And it became such a problem that they actually, over the course of years, went through this program of jacking up the city of Chicago block by block with these things called jack screws, which is depicted, excuse me, in that photo. And then there was like a hotel where people actually staying in the hotel while it was being raised an inch at a time. And they were raising the city by 5 to 10 feet in places. And it was all because of sewage. It was a really interesting thing. But one of my favorites from this particular technology is this man on the bottom right is a fellow named John Leal, and he was in New Jersey, and he was the first person to use chlorine to clean drinking water. It was a time when drinking water could get you sick, and it was also at a time when chlorine was thought of as a poison. That he had figured out if you use chlorine in just really small amounts, it could really sanitize, clean the water enough to get rid of a lot of these waterborne illnesses. And so he actually took it upon himself to go to the water supply reservoir and put some chlorine tablets in there because he believed in this so much. And he didn't ask anybody's permission, he just did it. And then later he got brought up on charges and he was accused of trying to profiteer off of his grand idea. And I give this guy a lot of credit, and he actually said, no, I actually don't want to make any money off of this. I want to share this idea with the world just so everybody can have clean drinking water. And I really love that story because that's the sort of thing that, makes it possible for us to have modern civilization like we do. Okay, so the third one is light. And, light gives us the possibility, light bulbs and different things gives us the possibility of storytelling with photography and videography. It lets us have movies like Star Wars, lets us have photojournalism and capture a lot of different things. It lets us have ultraviolet light to clean the water. One of the interesting things is apparently the best candles before there were light bulbs came from sperm whales. So it was a big contributor to the whaling industry. So the candles were brighter, they burned longer. And it led to a lot of whales getting killed. So thank goodness for the light bulb. The next one is time. So the invention of better timepieces, interestingly, actually, one of the biggest things it led to was better navigation at sea, because apparently if you want to calculate your longitude at sea really accurately, you need to have a clock set to the prime meridian and a clock, and basically you'd use a sundial to tell the time where you're at. And from that, you could really calculate your longitude to a really specific location. And I guess it's still used today with the atomic clocks and all that. So the GPS out in outer space uses time differences from your phone to the satellites out in space to triangulate your position. So it's this really fascinating technology that allows me to find a Starbucks when I need one ASAP and know exactly where one is, because the phone knows where I am, and it's because of the time. One of the downsides societally is prior to really good timepieces is we didn't have the time clock or being paid by the hour. That was a new thing after really good timepieces were invented. Okay, number 4 was sound. The invention of really good sound technology led to the ability to broadcast your voice beyond people that could just hear you in person. So on a downside, it lets somebody like Hitler talk to a whole stadium of people, or maybe broadcast his message to tens or hundreds of millions of people at once versus just who could hear him in person. But it also, led leads to things like ultrasound, radio, telescopes, lets us explore outer space. The first person that tried to record sound was a court stenographer. And so he was trying to take a funnel and get it down into a pen that would make these scribbles on a piece of paper. And he was just hoping to interpret the scribbles so he wouldn't have to work so hard writing down what people were saying in court. He wasn't until Thomas Edison until they thought of playback. So that was kind of interesting where that first came from. And then the last one is glass. And glass is interesting because the invention of glass led to things like a telescope. Now we can explore outer space and see the stars in a way we weren't able to before. It also led to the microscope. Now we can study viruses and bacteria and all these things that aren't possible with the naked eye. And it also leads to fiber optics. Glass is the main ingredient in what goes into fiber optics, and now we can have virtual calls. Yay! And thanks to glass. And the early glass makers, they had to have their ovens so hot that they started a lot of fires and burned down the town. So the island of Murano in Italy was a place where they put all the glass makers so that they wouldn't burn down the town. So that's one of the interesting things about glass. And I would relate it to our industry in that when we have enough space for our waterways, the version on the left versus the version on the right, there are a lot of adjacent things that now become possible that are not possible in really confined urban waterways. And also the innovations like, say, river surfing or other things or nature play would be another one. Inviting people down to the water is creating cultural changes of people really embracing the waterways in ways they maybe haven't in the past. And so that is the book, How We Got to Now.
All right, so next lesson learned here. Increase your self-awareness to build success. Sometimes when we think about how we build success, we focus a little too much on the skills that we're building, whether those be technical skills or soft skills, when really we should be devoting more time to increasing our self-awareness for a number of reasons. So first of all, self-awareness helps enact self-improvement and change. And it does that in a number of ways. So first of all, self-awareness helps us acknowledge our limits and encourage self-regulation so that we can set boundaries and really help us meet those goals. Self-awareness also helps us understand our driving force as human beings, which engages that intrinsic motivation to help us meet our goals. And then also self-awareness helps us build confidence to believe that we can actually meet those goals. The next one, self-awareness helps us build high-functioning teams. So first of all, being self-aware encourages vulnerability, because if I recognize my weaknesses and I'm willing to openly speak about my weaknesses, that's going to encourage other people to do the same thing, which encourages vulnerability, trust, and also psychological safety in a group. The self-awareness also encourages a spirit of curiosity. So the more that you ask questions about yourself, the more you're going to ask questions about other people. And that curiosity leads to open communication, which is a really important function that happens in high-functioning teams. Next up, in addition to the sort of pieces that I've talked about already, self-awareness is scientifically linked to positive skills. So first of all, self-awareness leads to increased creative achievement and the development of constructive problem solving, which in our industry, both being creative and also being constructive in your problem solving skills is really important. Self-awareness is also linked to higher grade achievement in students and also linked to increased professional and personal success. So bottom line with this one is, if you want to be successful, increase your level of self-awareness.
Well, thanks, Emily. On to my second book, which it just so happens to be by the same author, Steven Johnson. This guy writes great books, very readable, very good storytelling, a lot of cool history in the books. This next one is called Farsighted, and it's really about how do you make these big, complex decisions that are your most important decisions to make in life, but they end up being really complicated, multivariable, and all these different things. And he would argue that success in these endeavors relies on having a future-oriented approach and the ability to consider options in a creative and productive way. And one of the things I really found striking in his book and useful was he talked about in a really complicated situation to have this sort of divergent exploration of possibilities process that you need to not be so quick to truncate. So this is where early on in a project, it's where inclusion is really important, where curiosity is very important, multi-department and multi-discipline inclusion, asking lots of questions, exploring possibilities. It's outreach, learning, discovery. And you don't want to truncate this too early. And now you don't want to go on endlessly. Eventually you got to say, okay, we've looked at our possibilities enough and we have to go make a decision. And I find on our own projects, a lot of what we filter these possibilities through end up being our constraints. You would come up against your constraints in time and money and right of way, whatever it might be. And then eventually you have to make decisions and figure out, okay, what are we going to actually execute on? One other thing I would challenge people though too is with constraints, I think it's important to question constraints. You know, how important is this deadline or this milestone? Is it possible to find more money? Whatever the constraint might be, don't always just take them at face value. And those are important questions to ask. Another thing about not truncating the divergent process too early is in the book, Steven Johnson also uses this great analogy of saying really complex situations, any of these situations, they're kind of like either snowflakes or fingerprints. They may look similar on the surface, but they are each unique and one to their own. So don't be too quick to assume at first glance that this project is just like the last one. They have their own little idiosyncrasies, and we need to allow for that. And one of the other things he goes into in the book is he describes 8 factors that can make decision-making complex. So I'm going to go through each of those really briefly. And one is that complex decisions involve multiple variables. And I find this to be very true. I've got a project on the Globeville Levee in Denver along the South Platte River. It's this really confined, constrained project that's got floodplain, trail, utilities, railroad, CDOT, right-of-way, funding, schedule, politics, all these different things. And we need to consider all of them in turn. And so one of the ways I like to try to navigate that is to use these project management tools like Trello or Microsoft Planner, which this is a snapshot of, and it's creating these sort of shared project management resources. So it allows us to think together and keep track of all of these variables together in a shared resource. That's one tool that I really like. Another source of complexity is that complex decisions require full spectrum analysis. So this is where the more complex something is, the more multidiscipline it needs to be, the more multi-department, more multi-stakeholder. That's where you need to have, especially early on in the project, it's the engineers and the landscape architects and planners, contractor, ecologists, compliance folks, transportation, politics, all these things. And as an example, you look at just this bridge here that we built as a part of this project, all of the different people, and just looking at this cross section, all these people need to be involved in how we lay out this cross section, because everybody has a stake in what's going to happen here, whether it's wetlands that are going to develop or the clearance for the trail, or is this going to work for that train station it's connecting into, and how often is this going to get inundated with flood water, all these different things. And so that's where that sense of inclusion is really important. Complex decisions force us to predict the future. We can't always know how things are going to play out. And so there's sort of this sort of crystal ball we end up needing to use sometimes. And so one sort of simple example would be on this project where we did a stream restoration that was kind of ahead of the watershed upstream of it urbanizing. And so we had to think, even though we do have a 404 permit where we need all these wetlands to develop, we have to wonder, are they really going to be there? And we have to sort of hope that they will. It's one of those things we can't really predict when or how soon. Hopefully within the 5-year monitoring period, we'll get all the wetlands to form because enough urbanization has happened. Complex decisions involve varied levels of uncertainty. I know on my projects, I breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief once we're done digging. When we're done digging, I feel like the uncertainty just goes down dramatically. And one really sort of visible example of that was when Confluence Park was under construction. When they were digging, they found coal tar contamination from the old rail yards. That blew up the budget, blew up the schedule. They hadn't planned for that, and they had to stop and figure it out, to pause the project for a year, and added millions of dollars of cost. We're never going to get away from uncertainty, especially in more complex projects. Okay, complex decisions often involve conflicting objectives. You know, in most of these urban projects we're dealing with, we have very limited space to work with. And I think there should be a healthy amount of tension between these objectives, because there's just no way we can fit all of that in. A really great example is on Wonderland Creek, where we needed the creek to go into this ditch. We needed the trail to go over the ditch, but then under the tracks and then up to this existing trail. And you just, yeah, it was tough to figure out how these were all competing with each other throughout the entire project. Complex decisions often harbor undiscovered options. So that's where don't be too quick to decide of what to do on the project. We had this eroded creek along Grange Hall Creek, but the big thing was these sewer lines that were exposed and in danger of getting further exposed. We didn't have the money to rebuild the entire creek, so instead we decided to move the sewer because it was cheaper. You know, so don't be so quick to narrow your options. You know, think about, what does success on your project really look like? And if you don't have enough money, what is it that we're really after here? And on this one, it was just cheaper to move the sewer than restore the whole creek. And someday it'll be needed, but more immediately we needed to protect the sewer line. Next, complex decisions are prone to system one failings. And system one, this is the part of our brain we use 95% of the time, and it's where we are quick to make judgments and make decisions. And it's where stereotypes come from. It's where we don't think, we just know something. It's a snap judgment. And it's kind of like back to that snowflake thing, is don't be too quick to assume this project or situation is exactly like the last project. You want to use system two, which is that slow, thoughtful, rational, questioning thinking, where it takes more time, but you get more reliable results. And then lastly, complex decisions are vulnerable to failures of collective intelligence. So this is where the quality of our discourse and our meetings is really important. And in fact, in this book, the author talks about how in a group setting, it's human nature that we're going to look for and gravitate towards topics where we agree on, and we will be less likely to challenge each other on things when we do disagree. And especially if you have a room with 7 engineers and maybe there's one landscape architect or ecologist, they're going to just sort of naturally be less inclined to speak up or disagree. And so in those situations, it's sometimes even more helpful to, as a project manager, seek out some of those folks one-on-one, because you may get better input from them than in a group setting. So that is the book Farsighted. I encourage everybody to check it out.
Okay, so your discussion of big decisions actually leads right into the next point, which has to do with how we can enact and make change. And the lesson here is start with small changes. So humans are creatures of habit, and change is really hard. So if you want to make a change in your life, how do you go about doing that? So the first principle of small change is to start with just 1% change, just a really small element, a really tiny goal that you can commit to, and then rely on the compound interest of self-improvement. So the more of these little small changes that you make, the more sort of big change you'll see over the course of time. The next piece of it is to create identity-based outcomes. I have someone who's very near and dear to me who lost a lot of weight, and I had seen this person go back and forth with this struggle, not be able to commit to the goal, and eventually one day she did, and she stuck to it, and she's maintained it. And I asked her recently, how did you do that? What changed? And she said, I woke up one day and I thought, I am not this person. I am a fit person. And she sort of allowed that to activate her intrinsic motivation, and she was able to make that change. So when you're talking about making changes or meeting your goals, think about it as I am instead of I will, or I am going to, or I am trying to. I am. Make it part of your identity. The next one here is to focus on the trajectory instead of the results or the goals. So the trajectory of change is not always just a forward path. It's not always a straight line. Sometimes you deviate off to the left, sometimes you take a step back. So allowing yourself to focus on the trajectory overall. Am I headed in the right direction overall? Will help you to meet that goal and not be waylaid by disappointment or by the inability to make change as quickly as you thought that you might. So that one sort of summed up in the end here, start with small changes because small steps every day add up to big things.
And speaking of small changes, perhaps all of our viewers, what do you think, Emily? We'll start with one.
Start with the title, even just the title, small things.
Yeah, there you go. Go read the small things book. That's right. So here's basically the content of what Emily and I talked about came from all these books you see here, and then there's a few others thrown in that are our favorites. But if you're looking for something, we can vouch for these. These are awesome.
Yeah, they're great. All right, thanks for joining us, guys, and we'll open it for Q&A.